Dr. Albert Mohler agrees that even within the church, we have lost our understanding that marriage is a duty imposed on all of mankind, with a few exceptions, right? According to the Bible, marriage is not primarily about our self-esteem and personal fulfillment, nor is it just one lifestyle option among others. The Bible is clear in presenting a picture of marriage that the man and woman are made for each other. Thank you. The man and woman are made for each other, and the institution of marriage is given to humanity as both an opportunity and an obligation. Here's why I know that we have left this concept that the man and woman are made for each other. Because now we have men who are not made for men marrying men. That's how I know we left the concept. You have people now who are marrying their pets. Go look it up. I'm not joking. All right? Right. What they're saying, the premise of this is that because of where we are in our society, it was never intended for the majority of people to be single for life. There are exceptions. That's what she's talking about. People are marrying their pets. Okay? They're having ceremonies to marry their pets. That's where we are in 2017. Here's another one. People are marrying themselves. All of this is researchable. I'm not trying to, throw you off. You can actually research it while I'm talking. There's several women that have married themselves. All right. BBC, I believe, did a whole television episode on men. Yeah. On men who are in relationships with blow-up dolls and fake dolls that look like people. This is how we know that we've gotten away from the basis that man and woman are made for each other, and the institution of marriage has been given to humanity as an opportunity to reproduce and an obligation to reproduce. So the Bible assumes that marriage is a normative for human beings, not an exception. I'm going to say that again. The Bible assumes that marriage is normative for human beings and not an exception. And what she's posing here is because of the way and the direction that American culture has gone, we have gotten away from thinking that marriage is a normative behavior simply because of what our society and our culture allows. All right? So, just wanted to put that out there. All right? Here's another one. Here's another premise. There was a premise historically. Yes. There was a premise historically that there was a right time to marry. Again, this is not being taught in churches. I know it's not being taught. I know it's not, because I have several friends who got married for the first time and they were in their 50s. One person was 70 something and he got married for the first time. Okay? There's a premise that there is a right time to marry. Marriage was considered a duty in the past, and that one had a specific time frame in which they married. How do we know this? Let's take a look. The Bible supports this and prescribes a right time for marriage. The phrase wife of your youth or bridegroom of your youth is often used in connection with marriage. Now I'm going to give you 3 scriptures that you can actually go and look up that talks about this concept of marrying in your youth. Proverbs 5:18, Malachi 2:14-15, and Joel 1:8. But what does youth mean? It refers to the time when two people ought to be prepared to marry and to be given in marriage. Now, we know some cultures around the world obviously have child brides, and that's definitely not what we're talking about. We're not talking about men who take brides at 5 and 6 and 7 years old and wind up killing the child bride because she is not at an age to be prepared to receive a grown man in marriage. That's not what we're talking about. All right. I'm going to repeat those scriptures. The phrase, the wife of your youth, or the bridegroom of your youth, can be found in Proverbs 5:18, Malachi 2:14 and 15, and Joel 1 and 8. All right. Biologically, this refers to a time when the two are relatively young and can make the most of their sexuality in their childbearing years. Why? Because it goes back to being fruitful and multiplying. This term means the spring of one's life. The term youth denotes a time when all the rights and privileges associated with marriage can be enjoyed. So not just the sexual part, right? But also the ability to procreate and make children. Now, again, there are exceptions, right? There are people who get married in the youth of their time, and for whatever reason, male or female, they're infertile and they don't bear any children, right? So there are exceptions, but we're talking about the general practice of being married to the person of your youth, right? So that was one key, that there's a right time to marry. There's a time when you are in your childbearing years that you can and should marry. Marriage had a greater value than singleness. This was something that they believed back in the day. Now, again, this is a premise. So I don't necessarily believe that marriage has a greater value than singleness. I would say they're both a blessing, but the Bible is very clear that the majority of people, if we follow biblical principles, we know that everybody doesn't, but if we follow biblical principles, the majority of people would pursue marriage. All right. We do know in the past that past cultures did shame people who were single. Now, thankfully, we don't do that in this culture because I'm quite sure that didn't feel very well. But, you know, you had people saying things like old maid, if you've heard the term old maid, or you've heard the term spinster, or you've heard the term if a man remained single for a long period of time, people called him a stray bachelor, or they called him a rake back in England. In other words, he was known as somebody who would not settle down, who would not take the responsibility of committing to the covenant of marriage. And most single women were told to stay away from him because he would take your innocence, but he would not commit to the covenant of marriage. So those were not qualities of like, oh yeah, he's single, that's just such a good and wonderful thing. No, it was, oh yeah, he's single and he has no intentions of settling down. He has no intentions of getting married. He has no intentions of a covenant. The only thing he can do at this point is ruin your reputation as a woman. So women were actually warned to stay away from that kind of man. Now we think it's cool. I'm just saying, times have changed, right? Marriage was serious business. Marriage was serious business. Marriage was serious business. Back in the day, right, most single women were under the covering or under the charge of their parents. And if they weren't under the charge of their parents, if they weren't under the charge of their parents, I like all people. If they weren't under the charge of their parents, right, they were either teachers or like governesses, or they were in what they called a finishing school where they were learning the domestic abilities and capabilities of a woman. So they weren't just out in the streets, not doing anything. If they weren't under the charge of their parents, they were engaged or involved in some type of either learning or teaching. All right. Here's how serious a business marriage was. Before, yes, we actually have gone from worrying about the group to overemphasizing what the individual wants. Because people understood that marriage was a way to grow the community, right? Marriage was a way to solidify your future generations. They took marriage very seriously. Here's what they would do. If a man was interested in a single woman, he could not even introduce himself to you, not even in public. He had to introduce himself to your parents first and get your parents' permission to be introduced to you. And then your parents would introduce you to him. See, people don't want this kind of teaching. I get it. I get it. Before he could even say, hello, my name is X, Y, and Z, right? If your parents were not sure of him, they would do a background check on his family. They would background check his family. They would background check his reputation to see who was he in the community. Was he already engaged to someone else and he was just playing games with you? They would check his financial health. Was he in any debts to anybody? Because remember, during that time, if a woman married a man, right? If a woman married a man, that meant her family's wealth went to that man. So they wanted to make sure that he was financially healthy and he wasn't just allowing, he wasn't just pursuing the daughter so that he could get his hands on more money to waste or more money to spend. So they checked out his family. They checked out his financial health. They checked out his mental health. They wanted to know whether this guy had any mental issues or if anybody in his family had mental health issues. This is what the family did before he even got an opportunity to meet the girl he was interested in. The family did what we call and what our government calls vetting. They vetted him to make sure that he was even qualified to say hello. Can you believe that? They vetted him. Yes, they vetted him so that I don't even want your name in my daughter's mind or my daughter's mouth, right? I don't even want her to get an idea that you could possibly be a choice if you weren't even qualified in the family's eyesight, if you weren't qualified to even say hello and introduce yourself. So that's what people did back in the day. Okay? They vetted the person. And then once the family checked out his background and said, okay, he's clean, then they allowed him to introduce himself to the daughter. And then they did what we would call today courting, or they did what was called chaperoned visits. The guy was still, after this point, he was still never allowed to be alone with her. If he was alone with her, if he was found alone with her in what they called a compromising situation, he automatically had to offer her marriage. Y'all are not hearing today. If he violated her, he had to marry her. And if he chose not to marry her, then he was shunned by the entire community and he was blasted publicly as somebody who went around ruining people's daughters. So the whole community would be put on notice that this guy was a person who ruined the reputation of single women. But during the process, if he was really serious, if he was, proven to be a good man, he would court her. He would come by the house. There would be people around them while they were talking. So he would never have a real opportunity to be by himself with her. They would go to different public events. It would be a public setting. He would continue to court her. He would do things like dance, they would dance together, and he would have an opportunity to talk to her one-on-one then. But there was really no time for, this sneaking around or meeting up and fornicate. Like, if a girl did all of that, she went through some serious lengths to be alone with him in order for that to happen. But generally, there was a process. And what has happened today is something that she's talking about, is that the process has been removed. And while that has been a free-for-all benefit for men, it has not been beneficial to women. Because women were protected, and their reputations were protected by that process. They were protected by that process, that your family was involved in getting to know who you were involved in. Think about it. I want you to think about this. How many women have been murdered, sexually assaulted by men that their family didn't even know they were in a relationship with? Or their family didn't know anything about the person, or they wanted to keep the relationship so secretive that nobody had an opportunity to get to know who this joker was that was now involved in your family's life. Exactly. It's a price of somewhat of our disobedience. It's a price of our moving away from constructs that were safeguards for women. Now, we're not saying go back to the 1950s, where women had no rights. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about we threw out the baby with the bathwater. In other words, we threw out, because women wanted to, in the 60s, right? We had the sexual revolution where women threw off all restraints. And some of those restraints were there to help maintain your integrity, your virtue, and mainly your safety. Hello. So again, if you think about the process that they had for vetting men that came into these women's lives, right? You're going to say hello and then tell me I'm terrible. So if you throw off these restraints, then what happens? You have an open door for predatory people to come in and take advantage of the fact that there are no restraints. I'm going to say that again. When you throw off restraints, you leave the door open for predatory men to come in and take advantage of you. And how do I know this? I know this because I've counseled several people, even at the top of this year, who have had predatory men come in and begin a relationship with them. And now they're trying to extricate themselves from these predatory men. This is why I personally do not advocate for people being in secretive relationships where nobody knows what's going on but you and the person. You haven't introduced them to anyone. You haven't introduced them to the men in your life that you trust. You haven't introduced them to your family members. You haven't done a background check on them. You know nothing about their personal life. You know nothing about their health, but they're kind, they're charming, they're charismatic, but you don't really know anything about them. Exactly. I do believe that, John. If you can't tell your family, something is wrong with it. If the person does not, especially men, if he does not want to be brought to your family, if he doesn't want to be brought to your father, your brothers, your uncles, the men in your life that you trust, that have some discernment and can kind of tell you, they can read male body language and tell you what this guy is about. If they don't want to be brought around male accountability, something is Wrong.